Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the railway. Today I'm looking at a classic freight locomotive from Bachmann. Most of the models I review are brand new releases, and I love looking at those are always fun. But these days a lot of people are moving away from buying these brand new releases, mainly because they're too flippin' expensive. So I thought it might be nice to, at least once in a while, look at some slightly older models, see what they're like, and see whether they're worth picking up second hand. So I've decided to start today with this. This is the Bachmann LNER Robinson 04 locomotive. And this model was first released by Bachmann in 2010 or thereabouts, which makes this approximately 15 years old. Now the latest RRP I can find for this model is £149.95, but I suspect that price could be quite out of date because it seems reasonable. In fact, the latest variation of this model is the ROD version, which has an RRP of £194.95, which seems a bit more like what I would expect. So I guess if this was re-released today, that would be the new RRP or thereabouts. However, if you were to pick this up second hand, on eBay the current prices are about £100, and those seem to be in fair condition as well. Now even second hand prices are usually on the steep side. I think about 100 for a relatively large steam locomotive seems to be quite reasonable, but I've not looked at one of these in ages, so today we're going to take a fresh look, see what it's like, assess the quality and the mechanism, and figure out whether this is something worth picking up for £100 or thereabouts. Now this loco has its roots in the pre-grouping era. It actually came from the Great Central, and I'm not sure if Bachmann have ever produced a Great Central variant of this model, although I don't think they have. So maybe that's something we might see from Bachmann in the future, given how popular the pre-grouping era is. But as you can see, this is a slightly later version of the class from the LNER days after it had been reclassified. And I quite like that because it's got the LNER lettering on the tender and the LNER font on the side of the cab, which I actually prefer from the later BR lettering. I just think this looks a little bit more decorative. So anyway, the Robinson 04, let's take a look, let's see what it's like. So this thing is a relatively surly looking freight locomotive. It's a 280, which is quite a large configuration for here in the UK. And because the design dates back to the early 1900s, it's also got that nice old-fashioned look to it as well. So looking forward to taking a close look at this. Let me show you the end of the box then. So the product code for mine is 31-005. It's the Robinson 04, number 3547, and it's in the LNER black. It's also got a 21-pin DCC socket on board, so you do need a 21-pin decoder if you want to chip these things. If I flip the box onto its back, there's a very brief history of the class, so if you want to, feel free to pause and read that, although I will give you a bit of background on these in just a second. For now though, let's get this out and let's see what you get with it. So, push it out and give you your first little look. So there you go. I mean, I say it's quite a surly looking loco. To say it's a 280, it's actually not that massive, is it? I mean, I've got 440s that are kind of this sort of size, or at least not far off, which is another reason why I quite like this. You know, it's not a beast, although it is reasonably sized for the period. So yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. So there's that. Let's have a look at the paperwork, see what this tells us. We'll start with this. Looks like the instructions. So here we go. Thank you for your choice of the Bachmann branch line Robinson 04. Running in, well, that's been done quite a while ago because while I did buy this model from new, I have obviously run it. Body removal for both the loco and the tender. It shows us the location of the screws. DCC decoder fitting. The decoder socket is in the tender, I believe. Little bit of lubrication, buffer beam pipes and coupler. We'll look at those later on. Coupler, that's a bit of an American term, isn't it? And then on the back there you can see the exploded diagram, and it's your standard Bachmann setup for this sort of time. So you've got their regular motor, whether it's a 3 or a 5 polar, I can't remember, but I think it's a 3. Square bearings on the chassis, Not quality mechanisms, these. That's one big downside with this class that I do remember, although we'll revisit all of that later on. But hey, for £100, maybe that's something you could overlook. And then we've got just, I think that's a guarantee, and that's the Collectors Club. Right, so let's crack into this and let's see what we get. I can see a small accessories bag in the top, so let's pull that out. And here's what's inside. Now, for a Loco that was released almost 15 years ago, I'm quite surprised to see proper moving screw-link couplings. They are the proper ones, yeah, and really good quality at that. There are some new releases that actually don't come with those, so that's great. And then you've got the buffer beam details, and these look like cylinder drain cocks actually, which you can add as well if you want to. And that's all. So everything else is already fitted to the model. So speaking of the model, let's reveal it and let's see what the finish is like. What date was on the box, out of interest? The 10th of 11th, 2011. So if this came out in 2010, if the model was released for the first time then, and this is from quite early on, and as you can see, and as usual from Bachmann really, yeah, it's got a decent finish. There's a real satin finish to the boiler, which actually looked quite impressive back in sort of 2010-11, because a lot of models did look quite plasticky back then. It was really Bachmann that perfected the steam locomotive finish, and obviously now the other manufacturers have followed suit, but Bachmann were making locos look good from quite a lot earlier. Anyway, here it is, and yeah, this is quite a heavy loco actually. The running plate here and a lot of this chunky detail on the running plate is all die cast. And again, this is a feature that we look for today, and we say, yeah, loco's great if it's got a die cast running plate. And again, that's something Bachmann have been doing for quite a long time, as evidenced by this thing. But yeah, the decoration's simple, as you can see, but the finish is strong. And we do seem to have quite a few details on this. Yeah, so very, very well presented model. Now, I will weigh this and let you know what this weighs in just a second, but do take that with a slight pinch of salt, because I believe I have had to swap the motor in this. I don't remember exactly what happened to the original motor, but it either died or started to perform badly. So for whatever reason, I think I did put a coreless motor into this, which is obviously lighter than the original motor. So whatever this weighs, we can add a few grams, and that's pretty much what you can expect one of these models to weigh if you were to buy one. But yeah, good looking loco. Let's have a bit of background on the prototype, and then we'll take a close look at this and see what sort of detail it's got. So as I said at the start, the LNER 04 started life on the Great Central Railway, where it was introduced in 1911 to the design of John G. Robinson. Intended for heavy freight, 126 were built initially for this purpose. The design proved to be extremely robust and reliable, yet also simple. So much so that it became the standard locomotive during the First World War, with 521 more being built between 1917 and 1919 for the war effort. This led to many surplus locomotives following the war, so many railways such as the LMS and the Great Western purchased members of the class, with some of them even being sent overseas. The LNER operated many of these as well. They inherited 131 from the Great Central following the 1923 grouping, and they purchased 273 of the wartime RODs as well. 19 of the GCR 8M locomotives were also rebuilt by the LNER into 04s, giving a massive 423 in total. Some of the class were then used again during the Second World War, meaning that they were instrumental in both of the World Wars, and the remaining 04s passed into British Railways ownership following nationalisation, where they continued to operate freight services. Ultimate withdrawal took place between 1958 and 1966, and today only one of that huge number of locomotives remains. So there it is, up close and personal for you, the 04. And you know what, I don't remember this model as being particularly impressive in the way it looks, which is bizarre because looking at this now, it's a genuinely beautiful object. It really, really is. I guess these days I really am appreciating models more than I used to. And actually, in many ways, this model holds up against new releases pretty well. And it's got some gorgeous features actually, and we'll talk about those in just a second. In other ways though, you can kind of tell that this is a slightly older model now. You can tell that it's coming up to 15 years old or so. So let's talk about some of the downsides to start with. The first one is the seam line across the top of the boiler. Some boilers do have a seam line on there, and sometimes it's intentional on a model, but here it really does look like a scar from where the two halves of the boiler have been joined. Underneath the boiler we've got no detail, which is a shame. I think a modern and super detailed model would have something down here rather than just this flat shiny plate. Again, not a massive criticism. If you're picking this up for £100, that's absolutely fine. I think that's a compromise many would be willing to make, but it's there nevertheless. And also some of the moulded detail on the running plate really doesn't look that crisp. I think that's because the running plate is die-cast, and certainly back when this was produced, die-cast parts really didn't have that much fidelity to them. For some reason these days, models with die-cast running plates and boilers and such can look absolutely fantastic. They've really gotten better with that. But yeah, this running plate looks a little bit coarse, whereas the moulding on the plastic parts looks a lot better. And then you've got things like this pipe work, which is just a part of the moulding. It's not separately fitted, so it doesn't look as realistic as it would if it was separately fitted. These days most pipe work is kind of separately fitted and it's got better relief, although of course you do pay for that privilege. Otherwise though, yeah, this is great. Thanks to the chunky die-cast running plate, the weight is absolutely fine. It comes in at 332 grams, which is within spitting distance of a Hornby 8F, which is a nice heavy loco, slightly larger as well, I think, and it's even more than a Bachmann standard class 4, so the weight of this absolutely fine. Like I've already said, the finish on the body, despite it being a plain black, is really lovely. Great satin sheen to it, looks quality, looks pretty realistic. The decoration's very basic. We don't have any lining or anything like that as per this livery, although we do have the running number on the side of the cab, which is beautifully printed. Bachmann are always good at that sort of thing. And then you've got a little builder's plate along this casing, which again is a decent print. And for me, it's this casing that gives these locos their iconic look. It's what I look for to recognise this class. I think it's here to give the coupling rods and crank pins space to rotate, obviously when they reach the top of their travel, but yeah, it makes these locos instantly recognisable for me. Anyway, back to the decoration. We've got the front buffer beam here, which is painted red, and you've got the running number printed onto there as well, and that offers a nice contrast with the black of the buffer housings, which of course are separately fitted. And while we're here, we might as well look at the buffers, because they are the large LNER type, made of metal, and also sprung. So yeah, might be a slightly older model, but it's still got sprung buffers. We've also got a very beautifully detailed cab. The interior is painted cream. We've got the realistic wood planking on the floor, and then all of these pipes have been beautifully picked out. I'm guessing some of these are separately fitted because they're that neat. We've got a separate regulator by the looks of it too, and the whole back head is really well detailed. It's a very exposed cab and it's beautifully detailed as a result. It looks really wonderful. Let's take a look at some of the other details then. So we've got the lamp brackets at the front, which are separately fitted and nice and straight. We've also got the vacuum pipe pre-fitted too. The loco's complete with lots of wire handrails, so you've got them across the firebox and the boiler here. The side of the cab's got wire handrails, and the back of the cab does as well. And because these are separately fitted, they stand out beautifully. Around the other side, we've got a separately fitted reverser rod, which is done in the black, although that is just made of plastic, and you can kind of tell it's not moulded to the highest of standards. I think a metal one might have looked a bit better here. Here's a look at the smoke box door with that interesting handle, separately fitted of course, and we've also got a separate lamp bracket here too. The chimney is a good fit to the smoke box. In fact, it looks like it's even a part of the smoke box, which I guess it could be, but either way it looks good. Pretty sure the dome here is a separate part, but it's such a good fit that it really puts newer releases to shame. Very, very impressive. We've even got metal safety valves and a metal whistle. Real quality parts here with a real metallic finish. I'm not really too sure about the kind of steel finish that we've got on these parts. You'll have to let me know down in the comments whether that's accurate or not. Usually these are done in a sort of copper or brass colour, but yeah, here it's very much a sort of steely colour. But yeah, I'm not too sure about that. And then we've got the wheels, which are Bachmann's usual cast wheels, with the axles painted so they don't stand out too much. And then the coupling and connecting rods also appear to be cast, if I'm not much mistaken. And the crosshead here actually is a beautifully detailed part, also nicely cast. So as you can see, it's a beautifully presented loco. The tender is also very impressive. You've got the LNER lettering on the side, which again has been printed to a very, very high standard. The underframe looks great. We've got more cast wheels. We've got the detailed axle boxes and the springs, which are really indistinguishable from the moulding quality that we see today. Really, really good. And it's even got all of its brake rigging pre-fitted, so it's complete. There's lots of small parts on the tender as well, with different handles and handrails. And the coal load is die cast for some reason. Again, I don't know why you'd want to weight the tender down like this. I suppose that's instead of any internal weight, but yeah, whatever. Decent finish to it, quite glossy looking really, more so than coal is in real life, but the detail to it is absolutely fine. And then around the back you can see we've got quite a few more separate parts. Notably, these lamp brackets are not just a part of the moulding, they are separate as well. And you've got another similarly detailed buffer beam with different shaped buffers, but they are still sprung. And this model comes with full couplings fitted, so we have got a NEM fitted into the back of the tender, which has got a slight springing to it. And then we've also got a coupling pre-fitted to the front pony, which moves with the pony. So if you wanted to, you could remove that, but out of the box, the model has all couplings fitted. So the quality is great. We've got a decent amount of metal on board, lots of detail, not quite as much as you'd see on a modern loco, but if you're picking this up for 100 to 150 pounds, I think the level of detail and the presentation is more than adequate. In fact, I think in terms of value, it's quite a lot better than you would get if you bought new. So I'm pretty impressed. It's a lot better than I remember, although I also have some memories on the mechanism, which I'm pretty certain is going to be as bad as I remember. So let's get on to that. Let's see what makes this loco run, and then we'll get it going and see what this thing can do. So there she is, the Robinson 04, down onto the track and looking fantastic. And honestly, I really love this thing. Obviously, my main interest is in elegant passenger locomotives, but there's also something really impressive about these more serious freight locos. So lovely looking model. In terms of the mechanism, yeah, this one's really not that great, I'll be honest with you. Quite a rubbish mechanism, frankly. And this is something to be quite careful with if you are looking to buy some Bachmann locos second hand. Buy a loco from Bachmann produced within the last few years and the mechanisms are great. And that's because they've really listened to feedback and made improvements. Slightly older models like this though, yeah, they really are quite naff. So let's get into this. First of all, it's very light on pickups. In fact, even though the tender is connected to the loco electrically, there are no pickups on any of the tender wheels, which is really unnecessarily cheap in my opinion. So it relies on just the pickups on the loco driving wheels, and there's 4 of those going to each rail, so that could have been much better. There's also the typical Bachmann drawbar, which is not properly secured. It's very easy to unhook that by accident, and then the whole weight of the train is taken by those wires, which is obviously not desirable. The base keeper plate is held on with 3 screws, and surprisingly it is fully removable. It's not hardwired. That means you can remove it completely to clean the pickups and also access the axles for cleaning and servicing. It's single axle drive, which is nice and simple, so it's not over-engineered. In fact, it's a little bit under-engineered because there are no bearings on the driving axles. Now, I've proved that a loco with bearings will produce less friction than one without, and it's quite interesting that I've known a lot of the motors in these Bachmann 280s to fail. I do wonder if it's got something to do with the extra drag caused by these bearings. And look, if I pull one of the axles out, they don't even sit in circular slots. They sit into square slots cut into the chassis. Really cheap and nasty. So to remove the body, it's 2 screws, one at the front, one at the back, and you got this very, very bare bones chassis. And yes, indeed, you can see this is not the original motor. I don't remember exactly what happened to the old motor, but for whatever reason, I decided to take it out and refit a coreless motor. Now, this is not a good job. This is one of the earlier ones I did, so the mount isn't particularly neat, and it's one of the smaller coreless motors. I now know how to fit a larger and more powerful motor into this chassis, so if I was doing it today, that's what I would do. but this one's functional, so I will at least be able to show you this loco running. But of course this non-original motor will contaminate my performance test because I won't be testing the original motor. So to fix that, I'm going to use the help of my Great Western version of this class, which does have the original motor, and I'm pretty certain that the chassis is pretty much the same on this as it is the 04. So it's a 3-pole motor with no flywheel. Not fantastic motors in my opinion, but generally they are functional. I do have a theory though as to what actually happened with the motors on these. So we saw on the box for this loco that the manufacture date was 2011, but I can tell you for a fact I did not buy this loco anywhere close to 2011. I bought it brand new at a significant discount quite a few years after that. And that tells me that this was sat in stock for many years at the very least, and perhaps the lubricant on the motor had gone dry or perhaps solidified slightly, become thicker than it should be, produced extra strain on the motor, and that could be what caused it to fail. And it's interesting because the Great Western version that I've got, I also remember buying that from Hatton's brand new but at a massive discount, and the first one of those I had actually failed within a short time really, and I had to send that one back to be replaced. So that's my theory as to what went wrong with this. I think it was left in stock for too long, and by the time I got it, the motor was no good. So again, this is something to bear in mind with your second-hand purchases. But like I say, it's a bare bones chassis. There are no lights or anything on this, which is pretty typical for a loco from this period. Pretty much par for the course, I suppose. And then in terms of DCC, the tender body is quite easy to remove. There are 4 screws, and then the sort of chassis slides out. And there is actually a weight on the tender chassis, so we've got that and a metal coal load, so it's a reasonably heavy tender actually. And then you've got the 21-pin DCC socket, which doesn't have a speaker wired up to it, although there is a space for a speaker in this tender, and you've got some pads there that you can solder a speaker onto if you want. And then finally, the gauge is just below the standard at 14.3mm back to back, which I don't think should cause any problems. So with that then, let's do some performance. Let me show you how this runs. Again, bear in mind this does not have the original motor. Now I'm lucky because the motor I've put in here runs very, very similarly to the original motor, but it is not the original motor. Once I've showed you how this runs, I'm going to show you briefly the Great Western version running, which as far as I can tell has an identical chassis, and that has the original motor, so that'll give you a better idea of how these actually run with the original setup. But first of all, let me show you this running. I think the RPM of the motor I've put in is pretty similar because they still run at quite similar speeds. So let me go for 50%. There you go. So the gearing, I would say fundamentally is pretty sensible. Yeah, it runs at a sensible speed for a freight loco, which is fine. The torque, again, this is really testing the motor I've got in here, but it's pretty good. And again, the torque of the original motors is fine, although this is noisier than the original motor. The original's a lot quieter than that. And then the crawl, I think this is actually quite an impressive aspect to this. It's not amazing, but when you consider how tiny that cordless motor is, I think it's reasonably impressive. So let's go. There you go. So it's not that slow. It kicked in at a reasonably high speed, but it is smooth. And I think that's actually better than I would have expected from that cordless motor. Perhaps it would be like this with the larger one, but the smaller one, yeah, this is pretty good. Not so good in reverse though, yeah, stuck a little bit there. But yeah, I'm quite happy with this in terms of a replacement. It keeps the loco running reasonably well. And so just to show you what this should run like with the original motor, here's the Great Western version. Now that's what it looks like at 50% speed. I would say similar kind of speed. Torque test, yeah, still able to turn its wheels, nothing wrong with that. And the crawl is quite similar. Perhaps this is a bit slower, but it's also more coggy because of that 3-pole motor and no flywheel. So it's not the most amazing performer in the world, but while the motors are working, they're perfectly good. So with that, the pulling power of my example here is 0.29 newtons, although again we can't rely on that value because the cordless motor in here is quite a bit lighter than the bigger 3-pole motor that was in it originally. So again, we've got to look to the power of the Great Western version, which is quite a bit better at 0.4 newtons. So that's around 25 coaches on straight and level track. Yeah, I think for an older freight loco like this, I don't think that's too bad. So for the 04, I've set up some open wagons and a brake van on the back, which you'll see in just a second. And that should be a good demonstration of what this loco can do. So let me set the direction and let's go and couple, see how gently I can do it. Here we go. Okay, take it real steady. Okay, I think that looked like it coupled, so let's go forwards really gently. Give it a little bit more. And let's see how it gets on. I'll set this to about 35 speed, which looks pretty good for freight if you ask me. And then on the middle line, I've got the Great Western version, which I've been talking a lot about today. Mechanically, I can't see any difference, although there's a lot of difference in the detail and the variations. So yeah, totally different safety valves, loads of different detail on this thing. If you want to see me do a fresh review of this, do let me know, but I do have a review of that on the channel already. And then on the inside line, we have the latest version of this model. This is the ROD version. Here it comes. And again, this has been partially retooled to create the ROD body. Noticeably, the safety valves look a bit more like the right colour on this, but the mechanism is still quite poor, and yet because this was a later release, it's actually got the highest price. Not appropriate for the mechanism that's in there. But anyway, it's got some sort of ambulance coaches. Anyway, let's catch up with the 04, see how that's getting on. And I have to say, despite the mechanism not being very good at all in this, running at this kind of speed with a freight train, it looks magnificent. It really does. And yeah, as you can see, not slowing down too much on the curves, which isn't that bad. And yeah, it just looks fantastic as it runs along. And I suppose it's quite a rare thing to have a pre-grouping freight locomotive. I know this isn't technically pre-grouping because it is in LNER livery, but it's pretty much the closest we've got. There's lots of pre-grouping passenger locos, but designated freighters, yeah, not that many. So this is something I like very much for that reason. And there's nothing wrong with the performance of these really, provided you can get one with a decent motor, or I guess provided you can swap the motor to something better if something does go wrong. They are perfectly good runners. The crawl is, well, serviceable at the very least. The pulling power is okay for the freight trains of the time, and there's certainly nothing wrong with the smoothness of the performance either. So a beautiful loco, decent performance. I think it all comes down to price. If you're paying 200 quid for these, then no, I don't think it's worth it. But at the current prices, second hand £100 or maybe less if you shop around, or about 100 at the retailers, although there aren't many left. Yeah, it's really not a bad deal. Again though, I do recommend this with some caution, because if you are finding these brand new at the retailers, it's possible that they have been sitting in their box for quite some time. So when you unpack them, take a look at the manufacture date that's inside the inner box. And if it was a long time ago, you might want to just gently lubricate the motor and other parts of the drivetrain just to make sure it's not going to self-destruct. But yeah, overall, a gorgeous loco. No major complaints except for the mechanism, which is quite shocking, at least by modern standards. And now let's have some ratings on the Robinson 04 by Bachmann. The level of detail I've given 3.5 star. I love the decoration and the finish on this loco. It's very simple, but it has been done extremely well. The cab is wonderful, and it's got some really lovely features such as the sprung buffers and the screw-link couplings. On the downside, you've got the visible seam line on the top of the boiler, no detail between the frames, no lighting, and some reasonably coarse moulding on the running plate. So it's middle of the road, probably a bit better than average, so 3.5 star. Performance I've given 4 star. Now bear in mind I'm basing this mark on the performance with the original motor and not the replacement that you can see in my 04. So it is a 4 star, decent torque actually. Handles a reasonable load around the layout without slowing down on the curves and whatnot. Very sensible gearing, I would say as well. It's not too fast, not too slow, realistic range of speeds. And the crawl is pretty decent, although not perfect. So it can go pretty slow, but because of that 3-pole motor, there is a fair bit of cogging. The pulling power then, 0.29 newtons is the tractive effort of my loco with its cordless motor. It's a little bit less than you'd expect because the cordless motor, like I say, is lighter than the original motor. With the original motor though, the pulling force is 0.4 newtons, which is about 25 coaches on straight and level track, which is about right for a loco of this size and weight. The mechanism though, I've given 1 star, really not very impressive. Not enough pickups, no pickups on the tender whatsoever, rubbish drawbar between the loco and tender, no proper bearings on the axles and square slots in the chassis at that. Very bare bones chassis with no extra features such as speakers or lighting, and a 3-pole motor without a flywheel, which in my case did not last. So I can't really think of anything positive to say about the mechanism, so it gets 1 star. The quality though for me is a 4. Apart from the slightly poor moulding in some places, looks a little bit coarse, apart from the seam line on the top of the boiler, the quality is fine. You've got quite a bit of metal on board, the running plate's really nice and heavy, and the build quality as usual with Bachmann is high too, so no visible glue, no scuffs in the decoration, top-notch finish. Yeah, I'll give it a 4 star there. So the RRP for the latest 04 I could find at least was £149.95, and at the model centre you can find this brand new for £104.96, which is actually a really decent price. And second hand they're a little bit cheaper still. Now I don't think this is a complete bargain because of the mechanism. I think if there was just a bit more quality in the mechanism I'd give it 5. But as it is, I'm not going to give it a 5 on value because of that very poor mechanism, so I've given it 4. Overall then, that is 6.85 out of 10, or a grade of E. Yeah, it seems pretty harsh given how great the loco looks, but with that mechanism, I think it is deserved. So into the logbook we go, and it is 5th place above the Bully Booster and below the Lord Nelson. I can't recommend it wholeheartedly because of the mechanism, but it is a beautiful looking loco with some decent performance, although I must say I don't have much confidence in those original motors. So there you have it then folks, that was my review of the Bachmann Robinson 04. It has received a lower score than I gave it back many years ago when I first reviewed it, and that's not entirely because of the motor going bad and letting me down over time, although obviously that is something to bear in mind. I think it's mainly because now things have moved on. Models are much more detailed these days and they have a lot more features, not to mention the better mechanisms that they have even from Bachmann. So I think compared with what we have these days, yeah, this doesn't look quite as good. And I know you might say that's a little bit unfair to mark this down compared with locos that didn't exist when this was built. But this video is aimed at people who might be looking to buy one of these today. So I think it's important to know how it compares with more modern offerings, which is why I've done the review like this, but do bear that in mind. Anyway, do comment down below, what do you think about this? Would you buy one? And what sort of price do you think seems reasonable for this loco in this day and age? Do let me know, I'd be interested to hear what you think. But for now, that's what I think about this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.